Good morning. There was a man who got into a cab one day and they started driving, and he had a question that he needed to ask the cab driver, so he reached up and touched him just on his shoulder, and the cab driver screamed and lost control of his car. He ran up over the curb, almost hit a bus, narrowly missed some cars, and just stopped just before going through a large plate glass window. The driver, who was obviously shaken, said, "I'm very sorry. You scared me so bad." And the passenger, who was shaken himself, said, "I didn't realize touching you on the shoulder was going to scare you that much." And the cab driver said, "Well, it's my fault. Today's my first day driving a cab. I've been driving a hearse for the last 25 years. Old habits are hard to break, right? And this is the time of the year where people normally try to break old habits or start new ones. You know, people try to lose weight or get in shape, join a gym. Somebody told me a while back that I need to get in shape, and I said, I am in shape. Round is a shape. But this is the time when a lot of people try to become less round or better themselves, right? Well, I want you to know that God is the God of all new things, and He is ready to create in us something new to remove the old and bring about something great. It's never too late for a new beginning. Amen? Isaiah 43:18 and 19 says, "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the desert and streams in the wasteland." So whatever you're struggling with today, don't give up. It's never too late for a new beginning. And that can start today. Revelation 21:5 says, "The one sitting on the throne said, 'Look, I am making all things new.' And then he said to me, 'Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true.'" So today we're going to look at a few stories, 3 different stories of Jesus. And we're going to see how He stepped into old situations and did away with that and brought about something new. And what He did then, He can do for you today. Does that get you excited? Amen. Nudge that person next to you and say, "Wake up, He's talking to you." So let's look at this together. Number 1, God can make all things new for you despite what you've been through. The weather turned cold, so a Houston man decided to go outside and get his plant that was outside. They had this hanging plant that he didn't want to get too cold and have it die because it was freezing. So he brought it inside and set it down, but what he didn't know was that a little green snake had made that pot its home. After several minutes, that snake came crawling out of that pot and slithered its way across the floor and worked its way up under the couch. His wife was the first to see it, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. The guy who was just getting out of the shower heard this, so he wrapped a towel around him and ran downstairs. And he's looking for the snake. He can't see it, so finally he got down on his hands and knees and is looking under the couch when all of a sudden their dog came up behind him and cold-nosed him under that towel. Yeah, laugh. It didn't happen to you. I mean, he thought it was the snake, and he passed out right on the spot. His wife was afraid he's having a heart attack, so she called 911. The paramedics came, and they loaded him up on the stretcher, and they're carrying him down the steps of the house leading outside. They happened to ask him what happened, and he told them the story, and they started laughing so hard that they dropped him, and he fell down the stairs and broke his leg. Sometimes it's just not your day, right? Sometimes life goes wrong. Some of you have had a bad day. Some of you have had a bad month. Some of you might say, I've had a bad life. But you know what? God can turn that around, and we're about to see how he did it for one person and how he can do it for you. There's two crowds. One is entering the city, one is leaving the city. And they couldn't be more different. The crowd that's going into the city is very exuberant. They're excited. There's a lot of laughter and conversation. It's a group of people following Jesus. The crowd who's leaving the city is completely different. They're somber. They're quiet except for the sounds of mourning. It's a funeral procession. And the person who's passed away is the only son of a widow. A widow who knows when lost her husband, walked this same road before. The only difference was then she had somebody walking with her. But now she's alone. When she goes home and gets into bed, she's the only one in the house. When she sits down to eat, it's for a meal of one and a conversation of none. It's a sad story. But it gets even worse because to understand what she's up against, you have to understand a little bit of the Jewish culture and realize that this was a misogynistic society in which women were completely dependent on their husbands for protection, for provision. And when a woman lost her husband, now she's completely dependent upon her son. She's lost both. So not only is a lot of loneliness ahead for her, a lot of pain, but who knows what's going to happen to her. But as Luke tells the story, Jesus is overcome with compassion. You know, compassion is love in action. It's where God moves my heart in such a way that I'm compelled to do something to help. And so as Jesus and his followers kind of stepped off the side of the road, kind of like what we might do when a funeral procession is coming by and we pull over out of respect. So they probably were on the side of the road doing the same thing, and the funeral procession is coming by, and as that mom passes in front of him, Jesus says, "Don't cry." Don't cry? Like, who shows up to a funeral procession and tells the grieving family, don't cry? It's almost disrespectful, except for it's God who's saying it. So Jesus stepped out from where he was at on the side of the road, walked up to the casket and touched it. The funeral procession stops, and Jesus says, "Young man, get up." And suddenly the young man sat up and began to speak. Now, you're not blown away like I thought you would be, because when people pass away, they don't sit up and talk unless God shows up. Because when God shows up, amazing things happen. And Jesus, being moved, gave this young man back to his mom. Why? Because it doesn't matter what's happened in my life. God is faithful. He's watching out for me, and he's there to be with me and to step in and change things in my life. And we see this here. Dwight L. Moody said, "God never mends, he creates anew. It's never too late for a new beginning." You see, God uses trials to make us new, to strengthen us, to grow us. Henry Blackaby said, I never look on circumstances without seeing them on the backdrop of the cross. Could it be that the God of the universe is so reliable, so sovereign, so loving that he can use the worst day of your life to make you better, to make you stronger? When you face adversity, remember that God is at work in your life and he's working all things for your good. It's never too late for a new beginning. Number 2, God can make all things new for you despite what you've done. So we know that he can intervene when life happens to us, when things break our heart. We just saw that. But how about when I blow it? How about when I've done wrong? I've had people tell me before, you just don't understand. You talk about this grace and you talk about forgiveness, but you don't know what I've done. It doesn't matter what you've done. There is grace available for you. It was cold that night. It was probably in early April, and as Peter entered the courtyard of the house of the high priest, he began warming himself by a fire. It's kind of chilly in here today. Some of you probably are wishing you had a little fire here. And so while he's doing this, a young maidservant, maybe the one who let him in the gate, approached him and she said, you know what, I'm pretty sure I've seen you with Jesus. And Peter said, hey, I don't know. Yeah, you're wrong. It's not me. I don't know what you're talking about. A little bit later, another girl approached him and said, I'm almost positive I've seen you with Jesus. I recognize you. I think you're one of his followers. And Peter said, look, I don't know what you're talking about. I do not know the man. It's well after midnight. But even though it's late, the crowd is growing. Word is spreading about Jesus being on trial and his arrest. And so people are coming to see what's going on. And as the crowds grew, Peter became a little bit less comfortable. So he moved away from the fire, thinking maybe, hey, if I get away from the light of the fire, nobody's going to recognize me. But he wasn't that lucky. Somebody else said, you know, I've heard you say 2 different times that you didn't know Jesus, but I think that you do. You're a Galilean, as is he. Even your accent gives you away. And at this point, Peter became enraged. Look, I don't know what you're talking about. How many times do I have to tell you people, I don't know the man. I swear to you, I don't know him. And just when he had denied Jesus for the 3rd time, the rooster crowed. And his mind went back to earlier that night when Jesus told him, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter looked up and his eyes met the eyes of Christ. And according to the story, he ran from the city and wept bitterly. He blew it. The pressure was on him and he totally blew it. He let God down. But the story isn't over. You probably know the story that Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion. He hung on a cross, he died, he was buried, but 3 days later, he walked out of that tomb victorious over death. In Mark 16, 6 and 7, he's talking about a couple of women who came to the tomb, not to celebrate. They don't know this is the very first Easter. They've come to do their duty, to care for the body. And as they arrive, they see the stone has been moved away and they think someone's stolen his body. But the angel said, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He isn't here. He's risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you before he died. You ever noticed when you've read that he mentioned the disciples and Peter? Like he actually used his name. To me, he's telling them, I'm going to give you another chance. Don't give up. Don't quit on me now. There's still hope for a new beginning. So not long after that, we catch up with Peter. He's back out on that lake. He and John have been fishing all night. They've caught nothing. It's much like when Peter first met Jesus. They had been fishing. They caught nothing. They came to shore. Here's this guy on the shore who's teaching people, and he tells them, "Hey, let's go fishing. Let's try this again." And they go out, and they have so much fish that it almost capsizes the boat. And here they are back on that lake. And this is what I love, that Peter let God down. And where did he go? Back to the place he first met him. I just think that hope dies hard for someone who's been with Jesus. So he goes back to that place. They're fishing all night. They catch nothing. And as the sun is coming up, a guy on the shore yells out, "Catch anything?" They said no. And he said, "Try the other side." I'm sure they probably rolled their eyes. We've been out here all night. But they threw their nets out onto the other side, and immediately it's full of fish. It's tight. They can barely get it in. They're reaching down and pulling up and reaching down and pulling up. And Peter is so caught up in this that he doesn't even realize what's going on. But John does. John has one of those deja vu moments. You know, like, we've been here before. Where have I seen this? Fishing all night, catching nothing. Guy on the shore says, "Let's try again." And now we have so many fish that we can't even carry them. And it hits him. And he says, it's him. It's him, Jesus, Peter. It's Jesus. It's the Lord. And Peter turns, and now he recognizes Jesus on the shore. He doesn't even wait for them to row back to shore. He jumps into the water and swims back to shore. And he comes out of the water soaking wet. And Jesus is standing next to a fire. And they both know what happened the last time Peter was by a fire. And for the first time in his life, Peter has nothing to say. What would he say? I mean, this is a moment that's too pure for words. God is preparing breakfast for the friend who betrayed him. And Peter is learning his greatest lesson about what grace really is. And in the same way, God can do that very thing in your life. You may be feeling like you're beyond forgiving, but it's just not the case. There's nothing you can ever do to make God love you less. Romans 5:20 says, "Where sin abounds, grace abounds even more." It's never too late for a new beginning. This brings me to number 3. God can make all things new for you despite what you've been through, despite what you've done, and despite what you've become. Sometimes there's a difference between doing something wrong and becoming a person who's abandoned their relationship with Christ. And if you've done that, if you've become the person you never thought you would be, there's still hope. You can still turn things around. I want to go to Luke chapter 7, 36 through 50. We see that it says that one of the Pharisees, a man named Simon, asked Jesus to have dinner with him. So Jesus went to his home and sat down to eat. Now, when things like this would happen, especially if it was someone like a celebrity or somebody like Jesus with a huge following, a lot of people would be invited. And sometimes people who weren't invited would show up. Well, verse 37 says that there was an uninvited guest that showed up. It says, when a certain immoral woman from that city heard he was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. Now, it's interesting how Luke puts this. He could have said an immoral woman or something like that, but instead he says a certain immoral woman. That means she was notoriously bad. That means that everybody in town knew all about her. They knew who she was. They knew what she was. She was a prostitute. If anyone knew what it was like to have people whisper behind their back, it was her. If anyone knew what it was like to be talked about, to be glared at, it was her. But at some point, she's heard this message of hope and love and forgiveness, and she's thinking to herself, maybe this guy is different. Maybe I don't have to live the life that I've been living. And so she shows up, and she's so caught up in worship that she falls on her knees, and she's like clutching onto his feet. It says this in verse 38. Then she knelt behind him at his feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. Wow. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known what kind of woman is touching him. She's a sinner. So Jesus tells Simon this story about two people who owed a lot of money. Neither were able to pay back. And he was making the point that the one who owed more was showing more love when it was forgiven than the one who owed less. Even Simon understood that. And then verse 47, he says, I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven, so she has shown me much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only little love. Then Jesus said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. The men at the table said among themselves, who is this man that he goes around forgiving sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. It's never too late for a new beginning. Jesus took this woman who had done bad things, was living a bad life, and he showed her grace. And the same God who showed grace then, still, after all these years, shows grace now. There was a woman who was dying. She had lost all hope, and her pastor came by to see her. He tried to comfort her, but he just wasn't having any success. And as he was talking to her, he noticed on her dresser a photo of a pretty young girl. And so he asked, who's this girl? And the woman kind of brightened up, and she said, that's my daughter. She's the one beautiful thing in my life. But now I am dying, and I am painfully going to hell. But other than her, I have nothing. And the pastor asked, well, let me ask you this. Would you help her if she was in trouble or made a mistake? Would you forgive her? Would you still love her? The woman cried, of course I would. I would do anything for her. Why would you ask such a question? And the pastor said, because I wanted you to know that God has a picture of you on his dresser. And that's the truth. You're always on his mind. Isaiah says that he's inscribed your name on the palm of his hand. He has your name tattooed on his hand. That's how crazy about you God is. Max Lucado wrote, if God had a refrigerator, your picture would be on it. If he had a wallet, your photo would be in it. He sends you flowers every spring and a sunrise every morning. Face it, friend, he's crazy about you. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, what this means is that those who become Christians become new persons. They are not the same anymore, for the old life is gone, a new life has begun. And that's what can happen for you today. It's never too late for a new beginning. I want you to look at this painting. This painting once was being held in the Louvre Museum in Paris, along with others like the Mona Lisa. It's called Checkmate. And when you know the title and you see the painting, you can tell what's going on. In the painting, On the left is supposed to be the devil. He's confident. He's arrogant. He has a little smirk on his face. Things are going his way. While the man on the right looks really troubled. When you look at this and you know that title, Checkmate, it's easy to see and to come to the conclusion that this man has sold his soul to the devil. He's gambled with his life and lost. But as the story goes on, there was once a chess grandmaster who stopped by and saw the painting, and because he was this chess pro, this one really intrigued him. It got his attention. And so as he was kind of looking at the painting and studying it and looking at the chess pieces and everything that went into it, suddenly something caught his eye and he started shouting, "It's wrong. This isn't right. This isn't right. It's wrong." And people all over the place came and asked, "What's going on? What do you see?" And he said, "Look at the chess pieces. If you look at them carefully, you see that the king has another move. The game's not over yet." And as they looked, they noticed that he was right. The king still had another move. I don't know what's going on in your life. You may be really struggling. You may be dangling at the end of your rope. You may be backed into a corner with nowhere else to go. But I want you to know that the King, Jesus Christ, has one more move. Don't give up. Don't give up. Whatever you're facing, He can come through for you. God can make all things new in your life, despite what you've been through, despite what you've done, and despite what you've become. It is never too late for a new beginning. Somebody say amen.